There's been a lot of research on the effects of fatigue on human performance over the last 40 years, and it's beyond the scope of this course. We will give you some readings which will try to summarise that research, and there is in particular a special edition of Accident Analysis and Prevention which goes through and summarises in 5 global consensus reviews the basic state of the research literature at the moment. But for the purposes of this course, I thought it might be useful for us to look at a summary of what is generally known about fatigue, that which is unequivocal, and if we were to look across the literature and say, what do most of the research studies agree on, and what are useful ways of organising that disparate research so it'll enable you to think about the effects of research with respect to the workplace. In this particular section, we're going to focus on a conceptual model developed by Jerry Klein. It's called naturalistic decision making, and it's going to reflect some work done by a graduate student of ours, Renee Petrilli, some years ago. And in that, she attempted to take Klein's work around naturalistic decision making and to try and reassemble the research literature and express it in a way that was relevant to real world tasks. One of the problems with the research literature as a whole is that a lot of the research has been done by people from a cognitive psychology background, and their research is typically around button pushing experiments and short-term memory and in effect a psychological model of behaviour. While that's very interesting from a theoretical perspective, it's not particularly useful for people thinking about real-world tasks. So again, with this particular section, we're going to take it around Klein's naturalistic decision-making model and the framework that was developed by Renee Petrilli back in the early part of the 2000s. If we use the naturalistic decision-making model, there are effectively 5 dimensions that we can see that are influenced by fatigue. These 5 dimensions are situational awareness, memory, simulation ability, performance insight, and emotional control. What I'd like to do in the next section of the course is to go through a summary of each of those 5 dimensions and to put it together in a way that will make you look at the nature of the tasks that your employees are doing within the workforce, and you should be able to unpack a task in terms of how it scores on each of these dimensions, and then as a result look at the ability of this task to be susceptible to fatigue related errors. There will be some for which fatigue related error is relatively low, and there are other tasks which are relatively sensitive to the effects of fatigue. Hopefully by the end of this section you'll be able to look at a task for a particular group of workers and have some kind of gut feeling as to its sensitivity to fatigue-related error. The first of these dimensions is what's been referred to as reduced situational awareness. In many studies over the last 10 years, there has been a consistent finding that as people become fatigued, their situational awareness is reduced. Now you may ask the question, what do I mean by situational awareness? And it is one of those terms which on the surface seems relatively simple and straightforward, but the more you think into it, the difficult and the more complex it becomes. But what I'm going to try and do is start with a very simple analogy. If you've ever played chess, you will understand that a game of chess has a board, it has pieces on it, and those pieces move over time. The best way of thinking about situational awareness is the state of the chessboard at a particular point in time. Where all the pieces are, which of your pieces are threatened by your opponent's pieces, and which of your opponent's pieces are threatened by you. A good chess player is able to keep all of that information together and to maintain an internal representational map of the state of the game at any point in time. This is a very simple analogy for what situational awareness is, but according to the task, it can vary significantly. So for example, if you were driving a car, then situational awareness would be related to where I am in my journey, what cars are around me, what position in the road do I need to be in, what speed should I be travelling, do I need to change lanes in order to anticipate a turn coming up. On the other hand, Situational awareness can be quite abstract. So for example, in an individual who's working in a hospital, for example as a doctor, they may need to know who their patients are, what the potential test results of the patients are, what the potential diagnoses are, and what are all of the treatment options that I have for each patient at each point in time. Every task can be thought about as a complex decision space for which situational awareness can vary. The key point to understand is that as you become increasingly fatigued, your situational awareness is reduced. And that happens in a number of ways. So if we go back to the original analogy around the chessboard, then what you'll see is that a tired individual plays chess a little bit like a child. If you've ever played chess with a child, you will know a couple of key things happen. The first is that they tend to focus on the main pieces and they tend to be less aware of peripheral factors in the game. Being tired is a bit like that. That is, a tired person playing chess will focus on what they believe to be the key pieces and the key moves. And in many cases they can forget things that are in the peripheral areas of awareness. Why do we do this when we become tired? Well, the reasons for this are complex, but it's been referred to as the load shedding hypothesis. Again, by analogy, if we look at what happens in a big, busy city in Australia in the middle of summer when everybody is using their air conditioning, rather than run out of electricity and the whole city shut down, what happens is the electricity trust or the power company makes a decision to turn off the power in certain areas, and then they turn that area of energy off in varying parts of the city at varying times. So you will be turned off for a couple of hours. By systematically choosing areas and rotating these for short periods of time, you can maintain service in the vast majority of the system. This is what's referred to in the power industry as load shedding. The important point to understand is that there is a cognitive equivalent. As you become fatigued, or as the demands of a task go up and exceed the capacity of the brain, people make a decision, or their brain makes a decision for them to not attend to certain functions. If we take, for example, somebody driving a car in a simulator, when that individual becomes fatigued, if I stop that simulation and say to them, what was the brand of the petrol station that you passed 5 kilometres ago? What is the car in your rear left quadrant? How many miles to the next destination was the last 5 kilometre sign that you passed? People who are tired tend to not remember or to not encode those forms of peripheral information, and that's an example of what we call reduced situational awareness, and it happens through a process of load shedding and what's been referred to in the cognitive literature as attentional tunnelling. Attentional tunnelling is an interesting concept in cognitive psychology. It talks about the idea that when you are doing a task, there is a number of factors that you need to control and monitor. One of the things that we know as you become increasingly tired is that the brain chooses to turn off certain elements of situational awareness, and through a process of attentional tunnelling tends to focus on what the brain believes to be the important elements of a task. I saw this explained to me beautifully once by a truck driver who'd been involved in an accident, and he said to me, Drew, the thing I do when I'm really tired is I put my left arm straight, I put it out over the wheel, and as long as the white lines, the Mac Dog symbol and my hand and shoulder are lined up, I can't get into too much of a problem. That's a classic example of attentional tunnelling where the individual's focus is on what's in the middle vision, and as a result, awareness of what's happening in the periphery is lost. In that particular case, the truck driver ran over a mini miner parked on the side of the road and travelled nearly a kilometre before he realised he'd actually hit the car. Unfortunately, in that particular case, 2 people were sitting in the car and died as a result of the injuries. But that process of attentional tunnelling, bringing your focus onto what's immediately in front of you, carries significant consequences if peripheral or situational awareness is an important element of the task. The second area where we see influences of fatigue around situational awareness is the way in which situational awareness is lost. A number of people have looked at this over the last couple of years, and the major hypothesis in this area is referred to as the lapse hypothesis. In the next slide, we will talk a little bit about how the lapse hypothesis explains how situational awareness is lost in the individual's consciousness. The lapse hypothesis speculates that when people lose situational awareness, they don't lose it in a smooth, continuous way, but it actually is lost in short bursts of complete loss of attention. By analogy, it's often been explained like the difference between a light bulb and a fluoro light bulb dying. For many of you who have seen a fluoro light bulb die, you will know that it doesn't just stop working, or it doesn't get dimmer over time and then just fade out. What happens is it flickers, and the frequency and the duration of that flicker increase over time. What we know from the research literature around this topic is that the way that the human brain loses awareness as it becomes fatigued is very similar to the way that a fluoro light loses its function. That is, the frequency and the duration of off periods increases. If you look at the graph, you will see that attention is either there or not there on that graph. That is, 0 means it's absent and 1 means it's there. And you can see that there are short lapses on the left-hand side of the graph, but the frequency and the duration of those lapses increase until you reach the point on the right of the graph where attention is lost for a significant period of time. This would correspond to sleep onset in the normal individual. But it's important to understand is that cognitive function isn't lost as a smooth, continuous process, but rather as a series of blips in consciousness. In the next section of the talk, we're going to talk and discuss what happens during those blips, or what's sometimes been referred to as brain farts in an individual. But it's important to understand that that loss of function doesn't happen smoothly. It happens in an increasing frequency and duration of loss of attention. One of the things that's really interesting to think about, what happens when attentional focus is lost? And as you can see from this slide, the next area and the next dimension of the effects of fatigue on cognitive performance are around impaired memory performance. You remember in the last slide we talked about those lapses of attention, and that they increase in frequency and duration as somebody becomes increasingly fatigued until they inexorably lead to sleep onset. One of the things that happens during those periods of loss of attentional focus, or what we refer to scientifically as the brain fart, is that the process of transmitting information from short-term to medium and long-term memory is significantly impaired. Again, by analogy, you might like to think about it in the same way as we think about a video recording. If we think about a human eye recording the scene and storing it in memory as the same as a video camera storing it to film or hard drive, as you become increasingly fatigued, pieces of information on the periphery of the screen are lost, and the brain tends to focus on just a small part of the screen and miss what's happening around the edges. Similarly, as the duration of those memory lapses increases, then information will be lost to the system. This, as you may remember from the conversation we had with our union delegate back from a couple of slides ago, corresponds to his recollection of driving home but not really being aware of the fact that he'd driven home. Many people, when they're fatigued, will report having driven home, and that long periods of the drive, 5 and 10 minutes sometimes, will not be easily accessed as part of the memory. You were on automatic pilot at the time that this was happening. So you will see that there is an impaired transfer of memories from short to long-term memory. The other thing that people find in terms of the effects of fatigue on memory is what we would refer to as impaired procedural memory. Many people have had the experience of being very tired, going to do something and going, why did I come here? What am I doing? Where am I up to in the task? For most people, work tasks require a procedural memory of I have to do A, then B, then C, then D. And often, because you have lost attentional focus, you will forget where you're up to in the task, or sometimes even that you were intending to do the task in the first place. The third area where we see the effects of fatigue on memory are a reduced ability to recall stored information. And many people have had that experience of what we call tip of the tongue phenomena, where they're trying to remember something when they're fatigued, and they can't remember things that they would normally have no difficulty in remembering when they were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. For many people in common experience, this can be remembering the name of a book or a music video or remembering the actor in a movie. But those same memory impairment functions can impact on people in terms of the tasks that they do at work. They can forget to encode pieces of information and know what's going on in the job. They can forget where they are in the task or what it is that they were doing at a particular time when they're at work. And in many cases, it's quite possible that they can fail to recall vital pieces of information. All of these come together to mean that, as a general rule, performance declines as people become increasingly fatigued. And it's important to understand what are the underlying cognitive reasons for this. The third area where we know that fatigue has profound impacts on human performance is around what's been referred to as simulation ability. If we go back to that original analogy around the chess game, situational awareness is the state of the board at this point in time. But in most tasks, as in chess, everybody's required to think about, what am I doing now? Where do I want to be? What are my particular options? And most people at most points in a task are calculating out, what are the potential actions I could take? What are the consequences of that? So for example, in the game of chess, you might say, well, if I move my queen here or my bishop there, what will happen? And in most tasks, there is what we would call an iterative decision-making analysis. I go, if I make this move, the system or the individual I'm playing against will make this move, in which case I'll do that move. And then you explore what has been referred to as the decision space. You look at all of the potential activities or choices that you could make, how you think that the system or the opponent will respond to those, and then you choose the one which you think optimizes the system in the long run. What we know as people become increasingly tired is that the extent to which they will explore the decision space shuts down. If we think about this by analogy in the chess game, playing chess against a child is a good way of thinking about how the fatigued brain works. If you've ever played chess against a child, you'll know that they only think one or two moves into the future. The same thing happens when somebody gets fatigued. They don't consider all of the potential moves that they could make, and they don't necessarily generate them far enough into the future in order to get a good handle on the total decision space that they're operating with. And there are a number of ways that brains do this that we understand quite well. The first of these is what we would refer to as frequency gambling. That is, in order to save bandwidth, the brain will make a decision to say, well, what usually happens in this situation? This is the reason, for example, why some people under the influence of fatigue are much more likely to make an error than others. If you have a lot of experience in a task and you understand what the normal probability distributions of the system are, for example, if you're a doctor, patients with this set of symptoms typically have this disease and typically don't have other diseases, then frequency gambling can be a useful heuristic that you can apply when you're fatigued in order to save bandwidth. On the other hand, if you're not experienced in a task and your database for frequency gambling is not accurate, then sometimes frequency gambling can be based on what happened last time you saw this particular cluster of symptoms in the case of a doctor. It's very important to understand that when the brain tries to save bandwidth when it's tired, it engages in a series of reflex responses, and these aren't always accurate. The second area that we see impaired simulation ability is a reduced projection of options into the distance. So going back again to the chess analogy, how far forward do you think? How many moves in advance? And if you've ever played chess, you'll know that good chess players are thinking 3, 4, or even 5 moves ahead. Some of the best computer chess programs are thinking 8 or 9 moves in terms of exploring the decision space. But if you're playing with a child, they may only think 1 move in advance, sometimes not even that far. And again, by analogy, that's what happens when people become tired. They don't consider as many options and they don't project the consequences into the future nearly enough. This can carry profound implications for how well one performs a task, because in a sense, one may not know enough about the situation and one may have not thought deeply enough about the potential issues that may arise on the basis of what decision we do or don't make. The fourth area where we know fatigue has a profound effect is around what we refer to as performance insight. In very simple terms, as you become increasingly fatigued, you are less likely to monitor your own performance. And as a consequence of that, the system that you are responsible for, whether that be yourself, the task, or an operational environment, is less likely to be identified as being out of the target zone. If we were to use a very simple thermostat analogy, as you become increasingly tired, the thermostat checks less often what the temperature should be. And as a consequence, the temperature can get either too hot or too cold and make it difficult for the system to respond in a reasoned and incremental way. You can see this, for example, in somebody driving a car when they're tired. Two of the most profound performance changes that we see in a tired person driving a car is that they will either drive the car too fast or too slow. That is, we will see speed variability, or conversely, their position on the road will wander. The classic fatigue-related accident is where somebody drives off the road and fails to notice that they are no longer on the road surface, or what has been referred to as steering lane variability. Both of these phenomena are caused by the fact that you are not monitoring your speed or your lane position sufficiently frequently to maintain high-level driving performance. Many of you will have had the experience of driving tired and noticing when you drive up a hill when you're tired, you're much more likely to slow down. And conversely, when you drive downhill, particularly on a long, slow grade, that you will see that the car speed can go up 20 or 30 kilometres over the speed limit. Many of you will remember when you were learning to drive a car, the driving instructor would tell you about the loop where you watch the mirror, the speedo, the rear vision mirror, the left mirror, and go around in what's called a check loop. One of the things that we know as people become increasingly fatigued is the likelihood of them maintaining those check loops decreases, and therefore the potential for the system to swing out of control increases. Indeed, some of the great fatigue-related accidents in history are perfect examples of this. The Chernobyl nuclear meltdown is a classic example where people allowed the system to get too far out of whack and then overreacted in response to it. You will see the same thing in a tired driver, that they will often veer onto the verge and then overcorrect and come back into the centre. But the important point to understand is that self-monitoring of performance declines as one becomes increasingly fatigued, and that can lead to all sorts of meta-performance changes. The key point in understanding is that there is greater divergence from the desired system state. So in any particular task that you're required to undertake, everybody will be constantly monitoring that system and saying, where are we meant to be? Where are we actually at this point in time? And what corrective action is required at this point in time. The simple physics of a system tell you that is, if you monitor the divergence between actual and desired state less frequently, the potential to go out of the desired state and then the need to react much more vigorously is also increased. And we can see this in a range of tasks. That notion of looking at the check loop, desired system state, actual system state, corrective action required, and that basic do-check loop, and the effects of fatigue on that basic do-check loop underlie many of the reasons people make significant errors when they're fatigued. The last dimension in terms of the effects of fatigue on cognitive performance are around reduced emotional control. Not surprisingly, tired people are grumpy people, but we also know from the research that there's a number of systematic ways in which people's behaviour changes as they become increasingly fatigued. In order to understand this, it's very useful to think about fatigue from its biological background. The purpose of fatigue is to tell the body that it has run out of energy and needs to recover. Not surprisingly, as the body becomes increasingly fatigued, you will see a process of what we refer to as cognitive disengagement. You saw that in the slides previously where people's attention wandered, the ability to transfer stuff from short-term to long-term or medium-term memory decreased. There is a process whereby the human disengages from their environment and prepares for sleep. Not surprisingly, at the emotional level, we see a number of factors producing a similar effect. So for example, if you've ever driven with somebody who is tired in a car on a long country road, you will notice that as people become increasingly tired, the frequency and duration of their communications drops. That is, people will become increasingly terse in their communications. Yes, no, I don't mind. It's a very common experience for people to say, I know when somebody's tired because they stop talking to me. The other thing that you'll see as people become increasingly tired is that they tend to resort to more instinctual behaviours, and in team-based tasks we see what we refer to as increased authority gradients. That's a fancy way of saying that when people are tired, they say, do it because I said so. And I'd like you to think about a couple of very simple analogies. Imagine if you have a young child, you've just finished night shift and you're coming home, you've gone to bed, and your young son or daughter comes in after you've been asleep for about an hour and says, Mummy, Daddy, why is the sky blue? How are you going to answer that question at that point, being tired and grumpy? You might say, go and ask your mother. It just is. But in many cases, tired people don't engage with other people in a way that treats them as equals and peers. That increased authority gradient can lead to all sorts of changes in team performance as people become more and more fatigued. Nobody likes to come and tell the boss bad news. People especially don't like to tell the boss bad news when they're tired. So what we see as people become increasingly fatigued is that the authority gradient steepens, communications become terser, that is, people speak less, and they tend to transmit less information when they do speak. The net consequences of this is that the mental model people hold inside of situational awareness can often be degraded because of the communications required to maintain situational awareness. This can be seen very significantly in emergency services or critical incident management teams in a bushfire, for example, where the person in charge of the event requires continuous input of information from colleagues and co-workers and people out in the field. As that individual becomes more fatigued, or people in the field become more fatigued, then the transfer of information to those individuals, primarily because of the emotional changes, can often result in less information being transferred to the central processor of that information. And as a result, that person isn't necessarily aware of what's going on. This at the team level is an example of what we talked about in terms of reduced situational awareness at the individual level a little bit earlier. The other thing that we find when people are tired is that they have reduced compliance with standard operating procedures. Sometimes this has been referred to as people cutting corners. I can't be bothered doing it, I don't have the motivation to comply. So for example, work that has been done with nurses in hospitals has shown that back injuries through failure to use a lifting machine are much more common in tired workers working at night because they just can't be bothered going to get the lifting machine. So in many cases we can see that fatigue produces reduction in compliance with standard operating procedures, and in many cases the consequence of this is increased risk of accident and injuries. Never forget that tired people are grumpy people, and people being grumpy can influence the way the team conceptualises, formalises and carries out the tasks that they are required to do.